Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I'm professor of history and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to Documents in Detail. Documents in Detail is teachingamericanhistory.org's new webinar series. In each episode, we'll do a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of said document, while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a video to request with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us think about the topics of this year's webinars, we're drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's extensive document database available to all of you at TAH.org. You can participate in this evening's discussion simply by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. I will be paying attention to those questions and chiming in with them when I see an opportunity. The subject of today's program is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's address delivered at Seneca Falls. And to help discuss it tonight are Dr. Natalie Taylor, Associate Professor of Political Science at Skidmore College, and Dr. Emily Hess, Visiting Assistant Professor of History at Ashland University. Doctors Hess and Taylor, welcome. Let me start with a very straightforward question. What is so important about this document?
Dr. Taylor, would you like to field that first?
Okay, I'm happy to. Thanks for including me in the webinar. This is my first go around, so hopefully the other participants will be forgiving as I get used to the technology. Well, maybe I can start address that question by telling you a little bit about how I place it into a course, and so that you can see how I think it's important in the course of American political development. So I do teach political philosophy, including American political thought at Skidmore, and in the MAG program, I teach the course on the Revolution and another course on reform and gender. And so in the course on American political thought, I always included Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a way to demonstrate to the students that she's really as an example of American liberalism. So I think many of you may have been familiar with or have seen in preparation for the webinar her Declaration of Sentiments, which is based on the Declaration of Independence. And so I show the students, it's not too hard, that this is just another version in which she will use the expansion of rights, relying on the principles of the Declaration of equality, freedom, and the kind of personal sovereignty that's distinctive of liberalism. So in this telling of the story, she's not very radical at all. She's merely expanding rights and liberties that are part of the American tradition. And so I think in that respect, she helps to show us that the rights that we enjoy as human beings are similar for all of us. I also use it in my feminist political thought class in a little bit different way, and maybe this is more an answer to your question, because the first part is like, well, she's not that important after all, because she's just like any other American liberal. But she also shows us the limits of American liberalism. And I think we see in some of the documents that have been prepared for this evening, the New York legislature speech, but also the speech at Seneca Falls, where she can't quite forget the attachments that women have to husbands and children. And so she helps us to think about liberalism and how it may not capture the complexity of the human condition.
Right. Professor Hess.
Yeah, I'm going to completely disagree with Dr. Taylor, which that's good because if we agreed this might be too short of a discussion.
Yeah, we'd be done in 20
But
minutes.
I also think that's the beauty of having two disciplines come together for a webinar, that from her perspective, it isn't all that radical, but being a historian in the way in which I teach and use this document in my class, I think she's extraordinarily radical, not necessarily because of her ideology. So I agree with Dr. Taylor in that her ideology is that of being a liberal and of liberalism, but the fact that you get this from a woman, right, a white woman in the 19th century, and in the same way what Betty Friedan did for the 20th century, right, and puts words to these problems that maybe a number of individuals experience and struggle with and suffer from. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton as her predecessor in the 1800s in being emboldened enough and courageous enough to call this for what it is and to suggest her frustration with the traditional gender roles and the separation of spheres, and this idea that because I have this particular anatomy, that this is going to define what I do for the rest of my life. And I really think she starts to pick at some of the commonly held beliefs that nobody really questions, as we see in the address delivered at Seneca Falls, of male superiority, whether that be physical or intellectual or moral. She really breaks that down. And I think the fact that she's even able to give an address like this in 1848 is just astounding. And so I would say it's radical in that sense. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is I would argue that she's the intellectual founder of the women's rights movement, as far as not only in what she thinks, because I think maybe Abigail Adams would nod with her in certain aspects, but she actually puts words to it and has demands from it, and doesn't use her husband and speak through her husband, right, and say, represent me in Congress, but instead, why do I need someone to represent me? Why do I need to be an appendage to someone? Why can't I be my own being? So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I don't necessarily want to say that she is a feminist. That's a whole other conversation. But I think she is one of the first to articulate the idea of individualism.
Yeah, I think it is a first for these documents in detail webinars that our two participants so fundamentally disagree right off the bat. So I would like to I'd like to hear Professor Taylor respond to that.
Well, I think I would say the reason that we look like we disagree is because the ideas the ideas themselves aren't radical, right? They are, as Jefferson said, the expression of the American mind. They've been around for, close to, 75 years or so at this point. What's radical about it, the right way it looks like it's, and this is that it comes from a woman. And so I think in that way, we'll give Elizabeth Cady Stanton her due. She certainly had the gumption to do what hadn't been done, but also I don't think it's merely a matter of screwing up the courage. She had, the kind of legal training through her father that helped her to prepare to make those kinds of arguments. And so she is really very steeped in the legal practices in the United States by the time that she starts to become involved in women's suffrage. And so there is an element in her thought that I think is a strain in all sort of feminist thinking. On the one hand, it requires a nod to the individual, an expectation of equality and agency of the individual. But then, as I think Dr. Hess is bringing out, that there is a way in which she articulates the kind of sort of systematic oppression that is at work on women in the 19th century as she sees it. And she probably, I'd love to hear Dr. Hess talk about this. I think she probably gets that from Garrison, that kind of, kind of institutional analysis that she'll bring to bear on marriage and the family and so on.
Dr. Hess, would you like to respond, and then we can get to some additional questions?
Yeah, I think Dr. Taylor and I actually, do certainly agree on the overarching. And she raised a good point when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or Elizabeth Cady, was growing up. She always hung out in her father's law office, and up until a certain age, she was able to get the same sort of education as her brothers because it was considered okay because they were fairly well off and had tutors. But it got to a certain point where her brother's education departed from hers, and they were able to continue, and she was just kind of in this place where she didn't really know what to do and had to go to an all-girls school and college, and that was very frustrating for her. But she would hide out in her father's law office because her mother was the strict disciplinarian, and so she just always run to dad and was kind of a daddy's girl. And she'd hide under the desk, and there's this one story that she remembers of a woman whose husband had passed, and she was financially struggling, and the property had went to another male in the family, and there was really no legal recourse for her, that no matter how well you know the law simply did not have anything available for women in that regard as far as solutions goes. And Elizabeth Cady remembers, going to the law books and taking scissors and cutting out the portions of the law that would have excluded her from being able to receive, right, the appropriate benefits that she believed that she deserved. And so early on, she has this idealism, but as Dr. Taylor mentions, once she goes to school, she then ends up going to her cousin's house in upstate New York, who is a very well-known reformer, Garrett Smith, and hangs out with various abolitionists and rubs shoulders with these very religious figures and utopian reformers. And she certainly is inspired, I think, by her environment. But yeah, I would agree with all that.
Well, we have a few questions from participants, but first I would like to exercise my right as moderator to ask one of my own. Clearly, Stanton believes in equality of rights for men and women. Does she believe that there are any fundamental differences between men and women?
Well, I feel like this is the question that animates my career. And I've started to get to this a little bit with respect to how the limits of liberalism, liberalism and the kind of liberalism I think that is articulated in the Declaration of Sentiments and her other documents, they do make a demand for equality, but that's the challenge. How do you create equality, and under what conditions do you do that with human beings that are so different? And so, biologically different, which, potentially, I think in the speech in the New York legislature, she comes pretty close to saying that that the biological differences make a moral imperative on women. And so that's sort of the trick of I think expanding rights for women. And we'll see how, I think Emily's exactly right, that she sets the course for feminism, not just in the mid 19th century, but even today, this demand for equality and gender equality that has come to the point where I would say that this conversation about the moral character of women and their moral responsibilities has sort of dropped out. But it's still there in many of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's speeches, including the ones that we have today.
Professor Hess, could you care to weigh on this?
I think if Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not if she were here, but if we went back to 1848 or 1850 and we were to pose this question to her, I think she'd say, we'll never know. We'll never know until women have the same access, in the same way that Frederick Douglass, 1865, 1866, says, of course the black man's inferior. We haven't had opportunities for education. We haven't been able to engage in the body politic. We haven't had XYZ. I think in the address delivered at Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about the many advantages that men have had in society. And so, of course, it looks like on the face of it, women are the weaker sex. And so we won't necessarily be able to determine if there's any distinction or difference until all of these institutions and rights are equal for all. Now, with that being said, she certainly is no Catherine Beecher, right? Catherine Beecher would say that women are different and women are distinct, and they are naturally more moral and more pious and more, and some reformers later on, not her, but others around the progressive era will say we are distinct, we are different, we are more moral, and so because of that we deserve the vote, right? Catherine Beecher won't go there, but many of these individuals, whether they believe in difference or not, will try to get to the same destination of equal rights. But I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton says we deserve equal rights because we are human, not because we are different.
All right, thanks.
Can I add something,
Sure.
John? I think that better than other thinkers, even later thinkers, as Dr. Hess mentioned, in the course of the progressive era, and more contemporary thinkers in the course of the 20th century, I think better than most, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, she lets those two principles of equality and difference live next to each other.
Mhm.
And so when she is making an argument for, the vote, or for property rights, or changes in marriage laws, she does it on very Lockean grounds, right? All of the arguments that we would be used to. But then she also introduces the necessity for women to have the vote on moral grounds, in part for the sake of bettering the political community in the way that Wollstonecraft and others before Elizabeth Cady Stanton make, but also for the part of bettering their own conditions, right? That it's the drunks that women have to protect themselves from, and other things that make the women vulnerable. And so the tension does not seem to be as poignant as it is in other, between equality and difference, as I think it might be with others. I think she lets those sort of sit next to each other in ways that are productive.
Okay. Well, let's go to a question from one of our listeners. Billy Gallagher notes, both in the address as well as Solitude of Self, an anti-Catholic theme. Could either or preferably both of you speak on that and suggest what motivates her in being anti-Catholic, perhaps?
I can't speak specifically to her being anti-Catholic necessarily. I don't remember where it was in the address delivered at Seneca Falls. I do remember a little bit in Solitude of Self, but later on in her life, let me preface it with this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton does not tiptoe. She does not walk on eggshells. She is not concerned about filtering or censoring herself. And so whether this was something that was passed down, right, and this kind of familial thing that she inherited from, her father, or was Catholics were somehow instrumental in forbidding women the right to vote. I'm not necessarily sure, but it doesn't surprise me that she may slip from time to time about discussing various groups and what she thinks of them. Just one side note, when there is a discussion in the American Equal Rights Association in 1869 about whether women should be included in the 15th Amendment or not, and you have abolitionists and people like Frederick Douglass suggesting that it's the Negro's hour, and women should step back and wait because it's more politically expedient for at least a portion of this population that was disenfranchised to get the right to vote, that Stanton spirals. And she starts to do this anti-immigrant, anti-Black rhetoric that, and I quote, Sambo, right, or the drunk Irishman should never have the right to vote before an intelligent, moral white woman. So I don't know if part of that comes from her disgust maybe for traditional roles within Catholic families, or simply anti-immigrant, a little bit residue from know-nothingism. But that's my knee-jerk reaction to that question.
Okay.
Yeah, my reaction is speculative too. One, there's I guess the general prejudice against Catholicism
Mhm.
in the United States at this time, and it has a lot to do with the way in which it's hierarchical in a way that's considered contrary to the American republicanism. So I think that anti-Catholicism probably has a pretty broad and sort of influence, and that as Emily said, she just speaks a little more clearly than others might on what her prejudices are in all sorts of ways, as Dr. has just mentioned.
Okay. Larry Fata asks a question about Lucretia Mott. I'm curious as to how much of Stanton's writing was a solo endeavor and how much she worked with Mott. I was under the impression that Mott also worked on the Declaration of Sentiments. Could you comment?
Yeah. So first of all, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has a hardcore girl crush on Lucretia Mott. Like, just thinks that she is the best thing. Her mentor, her just wants to be just like her. When she met her at the anti-slavery, Elizabeth Cady Stanton goes to London to the World Anti-Slavery Convention with her husband for their honeymoon. How romantic. And meets Lucretia Mott there. And she's just wowed by this woman's conviction, right? That she doesn't serve sugar at her table and she doesn't wear cotton and, nothing from the institution of slavery, and is really, truly mesmerized and inspired. Mott's supposed to give a speech there. She's not able to. They're supposed to sit behind a curtain, right? And then the light bulb goes off, like, maybe this is a problem for us too. So they go home and years pass, et cetera, et cetera. And Lucretia Mott certainly does help Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton is the primary author of the Declaration of Sentiments, but that's certainly not without the inspiration, influence, encouragement of Mott. I don't want to go as far as to say, if Mott was not there, Stanton wouldn't be either, but she was instrumental in her formation as a reformer.
Okay. Anything more on that, Professor Taylor?
No, I would not have explained it so well. The influence, I guess one of the, maybe just a small point that I would add is that, and I think the reason why we do generally remember the address and also the Declaration with Elizabeth Cady Stanton instead of Lucretia Mott is she was the one that really pushed for including suffrage. When others were a little bit more timid and wanted to take a more incremental position and stick maybe to expanding property rights and laws relating to marriage, she was the one that had really pushed for the right to vote to be included, and sort of saw that as the way forward. So I think in that respect, that's why we generally remember her associated with Seneca Falls, and maybe someone like Lucretia Mott, who would have been certainly influential and important in all the ways that Dr. Hess mentioned, but she just didn't have that gumption and that determination in the way that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did.
Let's talk about the right to vote a bit. Is this, to use the military analogy, is this the bridge too far that perhaps doomed the rest of the message, at least in the short term?
Yes. I would. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband leaves town, right? The week before this happens, because he's like, I'm not going to be associated with it, right? Enough's enough. That, he's willing to, have her, think big thoughts and read all the books and, have all of the children. But it was embarrassing to him to have his wife give this public address and then to go as far as to suggest suffrage as well. I mean, individual reformers that are at the Seneca Falls Convention are saying, Lizzie, you're going to make a mockery of this whole thing, right? Nobody will take us seriously. Like let's at least, take some baby steps here. And she just jumps in the deep end. There's no sticking the toe in the water. And this is one of the resolutions that they could barely get people to vote for in the Declaration of Sentiments. So this even those that believe that there's an inequality that exists, I'm not even sure they've spent the time to even think about whether the vote is the appropriate vehicle. It's not even something people have ruminated over. And for her, it seems like that's the answer to all of the problems.
Hmm.
I'm a little bit more ambivalent. I fault her husband for leaving town. That was not an appropriate response. But I do appreciate that it was a radical proposition that scared some people off. Many of the people who initially signed on took their support of that back. But I do think it sort of focused the movement in a way that it would not have been otherwise. And like I said, I do think it is in a partial fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration. And so to me, there's a certain logic about it that that I get from Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself. And I at this moment at least, I like that determination. I'm sure we'll start talking about it at some point, how that can be politically sort of destructive, but at this moment, I'm not sure that it is.
Okay. Cody Northrup asks, Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke out against the 15th Amendment for not giving women, including women in its expansion of suffrage, instead giving the vote to, quote, lower orders, unquote, of men. Is it justifiable to say that the African American rights and women's rights movements have sabotaged each other through American history in their individual quests for equality?
Well, that's if we have maybe the rest of the evening and do a shut-in and maybe for the next 8 hours, we could start to address that. But I think the initial responses, of course, maybe in certain ways, no. There are times where I think the movements have worked together, and both Dr. Taylor and I have taught a class called The Reformed Tradition in American History, and talk about the ways in which African Americans fight for equality and women's fight for equality, the way that they parallel and intersect and challenge one another. And there are times where they benefit from one another. There are times that they inspire one another when women are fighting for the rights of African Americans and they realize they're sitting behind a curtain, or when in the 1960s, a civil rights activist is asked what's the best role for women in the movement, in the civil rights movement, he responds prone, right? In jest. So I certainly think there are times where women respond to their lack of equality even within reform movements. But it does seem with the 15th Amendment, especially at this time, that Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and not Lucy Stone, there are other women that have a different idea on this, but these two individuals are working from an environment of scarcity, right? And this idea that if they get it, if Black men get the right to vote, that women never will, and we're not going to wait another generation. And so I'd like universal suffrage, but if it can't be universal, it better be us. So I think it gets weird. Dr. Taylor can probably articulate it in a much more scholarly way, but it certainly gets weird.
Yeah, I think it, and sort of ugly, or uglier, I should say. I mean, we can see already in the early 1850s that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is making these claims on behalf of women who have some degree of education and sort of moral standing against those who are sort of have moral failures or haven't reached the same status in the case of slaves, and I think as she refers to as idiots. And so that's off-putting, and that's there all along. And so it gets sort of ramped up around the debate about the 15th Amendment. And so I think that what is puzzling is the idea of the sort of scarcity, as if it just can't happen for both groups. And I would say I'm not quite sure how her rhetoric harmed her cause at the time. While my students at Skidmore certainly, can't abide that kind of talk, I don't have a sense of how and so I don't know, maybe Dr. Hess knows. how her audience would have received that, and if that undermined it.
Well, I think part of it is by the time that it becomes clear to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that they're not going, mail was introduced in the 14th Amendment, right? And that they're probably not going to be included in the 15th Amendment, that they start this Kansas campaign, and their push for white women's suffrage is fueled by Southern Democrats and by some of the most racist individuals in the nation, because so they're, I mean, who knows if they even believe it, but that's who's funding their campaign. And their suggestion is, radical Republicans are wanting to give African Americans the right to vote to change the constituency. Well, you know how we can remedy that? Give white women the right to vote, and then that'll, offset. So, yeah, I mean, I really think that as far as principles go, those become eroded so that she can just get to her goal in whatever vehicle possible. I don't think she's really upholding what she truly believes.
On the other hand, might it not be the case that any time the scope of suffrage is expanded, it immediately raises the question of, if this group can, why not this group? And in that way, in a very indirect sense, the movements assist one another.
But she doesn't say that. She doesn't say that, right? What she says is there's no reason why they should have the right before us. Like it becomes this, and this is, I'm getting worked up here. This is why I think she's very Garrison as far as the women's rights movement goes, because she can't just take a second and say, okay, so African Americans have the right, which means we should all have the right, and how beautiful is this? The democracy is expanding for all. Instead, I think she's just, she wants to speak her truth, and she wants people to hear it. And whether that does anything for her cause or not is kind of I mean, on her deathbed, she says to her daughter, and these are my words, like, I wish I knew when to shut my mouth. Right? Like those are her final words.
We all do, right?
I mean, of course, yeah, we all, I mean, I think that every time I leave one of my classes, but yeah, I'm also not, trying to bring an amendment, at least at this moment, but if you guys are willing to vote for me, no, yeah.
I don't have sympathy, obviously, for the sort of racist and prejudicial language that she used, but I am trying to think about the way in which she does feel desperate, like this is her chance. And somewhere along the line, I read in a letter, maybe, I can't place it now, but the observation that, women don't, they do find to a degree common cause with African Americans and with abolitionists, but by and large, they don't have the champions that other people do. And so maybe from a pragmatic, and I don't want to be a total apologist but from a pragmatic stance, if she's thinking, if our, the one group that's, willing to sort of stand with us is going to get the right to vote, that political momentum will be gone, and then where will we be? And so it may be that she has good reason to see that this is that the momentum is just going to die out over the next, well, it turns out to be the next 50 some years.
And I would agree with Dr. Taylor, because I forget which reformer it was, but said to Stanton that one issue per generation, right? He's like, first it's black suffrage, then it's prohibition, and then it will be women's suffrage. And when Stanton hears that, she just kind of loses her mind momentarily, right? Like, what? No. So.
Well, and then I'm reminded of this wasn't Stanton who was in this exchange. It was Susan B. Anthony. She got in that exchange that with Frederick Douglass, and his justification was, well, when you can walk down the street without being the fear of violence, then you might be able to make a demand that is more compelling. And Stanton's quip was, well, but still you wouldn't trade places with me. And she kind of was met with some silence. So there's a way in which women's circumstances were more degraded, and that.
Well, and then I think Susan B. Anthony also says, what about black women, right? And then it's like, Oh, and Douglas actually struggles with that a little bit, right? Like, yeah, well, and he's not as articulate or eloquent as we know Douglas to usually be. So.
Well, since you mentioned Susan B. Anthony, Larry Fata has asked, where does she fit into all of this? And why does she tend to be more remembered in American history than Lucretia Mott or Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
Do you mind if I jump in?
No, I've been monopolizing. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I haven't felt that way at all.
Okay, good.
Well, yeah, it is very hard to talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton without talking about Susan B. Anthony. They were friends for, most of their lifetimes, for, a half a century. And Susan B. Anthony did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention. They met a little, maybe 3 or 4 years later than that. They were introduced by Amelia Bloomer. And at the time, Susan B. Anthony was working in the Temperance movement. And so they met, and she had a profound influence on her. Susan B. Anthony had a profound influence on Stanton. She wrote that the intense earnestness and the religious enthusiasm of this great-souled woman, it made her feel the power of the convert, and it sort of goaded her forward. So in that way, I think Susan B. Anthony was very inspiring to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And certainly their relationship was fraught at moments. I think the reason that she is remembered, and this is where I'm hoping for some pushback from Dr. Hess, but I'm not sure I'm going to get it. I think she was just a better politician. She seemed to be able to adjust her message and her demeanor, and sort of speak to the times in the way that I don't think Elizabeth Cady Stanton was able to do so. And so by the time, I think she, made some tough choices. We just mentioned African American women. She knew that she had to keep a hold of those Southern supporters, and so she did not allow African American women to join the Suffrage Association, and so it was a pragmatic choice and perhaps not the morally correct one, but she made that decision. Then she was able to sort of also refashion herself as we got closer and closer to suffrage in the early part of the 20th century, as a sort of disarming aunt. She was referred to as Aunt Susan to the next generation of suffragettes. And so she was in many ways, I think, sort of politically more savvy. And then also, again, she was not as confrontational, and her demeanor was a little bit easier to like, maybe.
Okay. Here's a question.
Can I just add to that very quickly? I'm sorry. I like that question. Just one other thing. I would completely agree with everything that Dr. Taylor said about just knowing when to keep her mouth shut, right? Knowing when to nod, knowing when to nod and smile, like even though you don't necessarily agree, and just kind of like bite your tongue and hit somebody underneath the table. But the other thing to remember is that Anthony is she's the image of the women's rights movement, right? Stanton is married and has all of these children, and her husband is a politician and is traveling a lot and will come home, and it always seems like every time he comes home, she always is pregnant. And by the 6th child, she's writing to Anthony and is like, I have these big plans for the movement, but I can't go anywhere. And so she's Stanton's writing everything, but Anthony's delivering everything. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons why I think Anthony is so renowned and hailed as the woman of the women's rights movement and pushing for the right to vote is that she's able to travel. She has that mobility where Stanton, for as radical as she was, decided to have her children for a period of time be priority. So I think that's an important thing to remember as well. But the other thing, going back to this prudence and politician, right about the time that the women's rights movement is gaining more momentum later in the late 1800s. And they're trying to make this seem like a mainstream idea. Elizabeth Cady Stanton publishes the Woman's Bible, right? Publishes the Bible from a feminist perspective, and like takes it, like, she just sabotages everything. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm too harsh, but Anthony is much more palatable for mainstream and wants to make political alliances. She's exhausting.
So I think that kind of underlines your first question about this question of equality and difference. On the face of it, you would think that Elizabeth Cady Stanton would have been the much more conventional feminist, which seems like a contradiction. You know, as Dr. Hess said, she's married, she's got kids. And Susan B. Anthony was the only one of the that sort of cohort of women that were advocating for women's rights that didn't get married, and yet she was able to package herself as a more traditionally feminine woman in a way that was kind of intuitive, I think, but effective.
Okay. Katie Bradford has a question. In the Declaration of Sentiments, Stanton refers to moral beings only judging of others by themselves. Was she talking about men judging women, women judging men, or women judging women for fighting for more rights?
Oh, a lot going on there. Could you repeat that? Dr.
Sure.
John?
It's a little complicated.
Yeah.
In the Declaration of Sentiments, and I suppose if I had a minute, I could find the reference.
Yeah.
Stanton talks about moral beings only judging of others by themselves, so that is by their own standards.
Yeah.
Is she talking about men judging women, women judging men, or women judging women for fighting for more rights?
I feel like I'm on a game show where it's like, it's like A, B, or C. But I think what she's referencing, if you look at the intro of the address delivered at Seneca Falls, obviously a different document, but she talks about a little bit about this. And she says, I should feel exceedingly diffident to appear before you at this time, having never spoken in public. Were I not nerved by the sense of right and duty? Did I not feel at the time had fully come for the question of women's wrongs to be laid before the public? Did I not believe that woman herself must do this work? For woman alone can understand the height, the depth, the length, and the breadth of her own degradation. Man cannot speak for her because he has been educated to believe that she differs from him so materially. And I think just even the way in which she discusses the distinction of men and women there, that men cannot judge women. And although she has no problem judging men, right? But that's also because of the structure that's set up. So I think when she's talking about that, men cannot speak for women, men cannot judge women based off of their lack of access and opportunity. I think is
right.
Yeah. The following lines is he cannot judge of her thoughts, feelings, and opinions of his own. So
he in the address, she does talk like that and suggest that it's really because men have been socialized to believe that their situation is the norm and that they therefore cannot get beyond that narrow scope. Right. But in the Declaration of Sentiments, she invokes this in a discussion of infanticide, right? And that the reason why we need women, that women need to be tried by their peers, that is other women, is because a man can never understand the kind of emotions that might lead a woman actually to kill her own child.
Okay, so the game show version of our answer. And I'm sorry we're not doing Katie's question justice, because but I think that, so we should rule out that it's certainly not men judging women. That I think is true by both of what you said. I'm tempted to suggest, and maybe this is as a consequence of being too much informed by the solitude of self, that she's really looking for individuals, certainly women, but also men, I think, to be their own moral compass and to take the kind of responsibility to judge for themselves, and not in a kind of relativistic way, right? She really wants to them to, turn the hairy eyeball on themselves.
Okay. Let's see. Here's another question by Brian Gallagher. How did the press receive Stanton's speech of 1848? Was it well covered? Any noteworthy anecdotes about this?
Well, I think that's. I do love a good anecdote. I'm sorry I can't provide any of those, but from what I understand, post Seneca Falls Convention, one of the debates. I mean, it's a minor debate, but one of the debates surrounding this is, if it doesn't really get to anyone else, how significant is it, right? I mean, if there isn't the press, and if it's just 200 people that gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, what does it really matter all that much? One of the calls for the Declaration of Sentiments and the address is that there will be multiple meetings like this throughout the nation. And this was covered, but it wasn't covered in a way that of great scandal or interest, or it didn't sweep the nation, from my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Professor Taylor?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. And I don't know anything about how the address itself was received. I think the address itself is a little bit more pleasing to other arguments for women's rights, or compatible with it, than the Declaration of Sentiments is. You get more of the language, I think, about the moral authority of women in that address. But I simply just don't know how the address itself was received.
One of the listeners is asked about the relationship between the abolitionist movement and the movement for women's rights. Obviously, there's a lot that could be said here, but it seems to me that one striking difference between the two is one could be very anti-slavery, even abolitionist, and still believe that blacks were fundamentally inferior. It doesn't strike me that such an attitude is possible. If you believe in women's rights, you have to accept equality. Would I be off base on that?
I would say that I understand where you're coming from, and why you might get to that conclusion, but I think of certain female activists who are fighting for a certain, maybe not full equality, but more rights, and they will base it off the idea that they are different. So because they're more moral and because they're more righteous, why wouldn't they have a say in what's going on in government? And what is the purpose of rearing your children as being the pious one in the household, to simply let them wander the streets in this den of vice and corruption? And so I think there's the possibility of that, but I agree with you that for the most part, if you're an advocate of women's rights, of full political and civil equality, that it's not the same. It's apples and oranges. Mm-hmm. Maybe Dr. Taylor can, I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, yeah, that's my sense of it too. You don't, I guess I'm thinking a lot about Lincoln's argument for the end of slavery and how he tries to walk that sort of middle ground, without being, an abolitionist, and that famous line where he says, just because I don't want to enslave an a woman doesn't mean I want to marry her, right? So there's a sort of legal or political status of equality that doesn't demand the sort of full-blown recognition that we might see in other ways. And you don't really hear those sorts of arguments, either from women or other men that I can think of, that would try to temper the argument for suffrage that you get from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so it may be because of the women who are making the argument that they do have sort of a moral ground to stand on, and that is rhetorically, I think, maybe more compelling, at least for a time.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Please continue.
Yeah, no, I think it's so much different with the institution of slavery, right? Because I think if women were enslaved, it would be that same thing where just because you're opposed, you can be opposed to something, And Frederick Douglass talks about the distinction between justice and benevolence, right? So you can feel bad for somebody. And I think that's what Garrison did too often, is that he made people feel bad for slaves, but not feel this depth of injustice, right? So while they can be freed, and you want them to be free because you just feel bad, as you know, if you watch that awful Save the Cats commercial with Sarah McLachlan playing in the background, which is all the sad cats who are like dying, you know, it's like, give 50 cents a day. Well, sure, yeah, I don't want, maybe I don't want cats to die, but I certainly don't want them sitting beside me in a classroom or marrying them. But that was the way in which people approached slavery in African Americans. Many still believe that they were subhuman. They shouldn't be enslaved, but I'm not sure they have the same capacity as me. So, you know, that doesn't translate as well when you start talking about women, because women aren't enslaved. I mean, they may use the rhetoric that they're being enslaved by their man and not having voice or choice, but there isn't that same comparison. I don't.
Yeah, Elizabeth Cady Stanton really tries to make it, and she does lay out the sort of you know, formal sort of measurements of slavery, right? The inability to hold property and so on, and loss of control over children and all of those sorts of things that in the abstract, so you would say, yeah, that kind of does sound like slavery. But then, you know, she is spending much of her life in upstate New York in a relatively comfortable home with, you know, a husband who is, you know, maybe not the greatest guy, as Dr. Hess has already pointed out, but, you know, he provides for his family and so on. And so it's hard to feel that pity that we feel for the cats or the slaves, right, in a way that we want to see their situation change. Their immediate circumstances don't seem to be that all that terrible.
What about in terms of the relationship between individuals? What sort of relationship, if any, did Stanton have with Garrison, for example?
I'm not familiar with much interaction between the two, but that's not to suggest that there wasn't any. I know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass spent significant time together, and Douglass even stayed at her house once, which is why he said he was so hurt when he read in a copy of the Revolution that Stanton called him a Sambo, right? And you use these racial slurs to describe him. And so I think so much of Stanton's upbringing and being surrounded by reformers really helped to radicalize her and maybe be a little bit more outspoken. But I don't know of direct connections with Garrison. Dr. Taylor, do you?
I don't. But there was a time that, and I don't know exactly what took Henry Stanton to Boston, but that they were living in Boston for a short amount of time. And then during that time, her dinner table would be graced by some of the people you might expect to be, you know, swirling around Boston. And I think they might have met under those circumstances. From what I understand, at least in those years when she, you know, was not as isolated. I don't know how many people have been to Seneca Falls, but it is at a distance from Albany and Syracuse, and her home was even sort of isolated from the village. So if you think you've got 6, 7 kids or however many she had, you're not getting to see too many people. But you know, at those times when she was in Boston and other places, she was you know, kind of gregarious, from what I understand, in ways that we maybe haven't brought out in our conversation about her, you know, sort of single-minded determination and her, you know, her kind of the uglier side of her character. She did have that sort of sociability that would have brought her into contact with a lot of the luminaries of the time, and I think Garrison must have been part of it. Certainly, as you mentioned earlier, her cousin Gerrit Smith would have also been another way in which she could have met Garrison.
Which, just a side note, weird trivia thing, did you know Gerrit Smith helped pay for Jefferson Davis's bail? I just read that today, which is just like blowing my mind. But anyways, it's just a little side note. I need to read more on that.
Well, speaking of social movements of the 19th century, to what extent did the women's rights movement intersect with the temperance movement?
Dr. Taylor, do you want to?
Well, the temperance movement gave us Susan B. Anthony, so there was an intersection both with the people that were involved, but I also think that at a moment, I guess the early 1850s, and again, this is getting to be a common story. Women are being excluded from speaking in public in at temperance events, and so they want to form their own organizations. And then there was one instance in which the men had sort of mechanically or sort of politically made it impossible for the women to rise to office within their own association, and it kind of raises, as we might say today, their feminist consciousness. So I think there is a lot of going back and forth between the two. As we've been saying, the claim to participate in public life on the sort of moral stature of women, that would have also been, I mean, temperance would have been the first and most important, I think, cause for that.
Okay. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. Would either of you care to make a closing statement as to what our listeners should remember about Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
Oh man, Dr. Taylor, I'll let you go first. Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, I guess I guess I want to, and I think this is going to be a challenge with the high school students. I have this challenge with my students at Skidmore, is that they very quickly and easily want to forget her because of her what is understood widely as racism today, and the ways in which she had like I said, I think she's got those prejudices all along, and they just sort of get amped up at at the political moment. But I do go back to an earlier point where she was the woman who had the drive and the single-mindedness to pursue the vote, and in doing that at Seneca Falls, I think she sets us on a course that I just don't know that when it would have come up, retrospectively, and maybe this is what historians hate, but I'm a political scientist, so I'm gonna sort of we're still gonna have the Civil War, and it doesn't seem like that's going to be the moment when votes for women start to gain momentum, and so it seems like she really gets that on the agenda and keeps it on the agenda. Unfortunately, it's for longer than we would have liked, but so I think that social movements need that kind of determination as much as they need someone like Susan B. Anthony, who has sort of the political savvy to, try to take the rough edges off of someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, for as much as I bashed her this past hour, I do love talking about her, and I do greatly admire her. I mean, she stays within the American tradition, as Dr. Taylor reminded us at the beginning of this webinar, and she really applies natural rights to sex inequality of the 19th century, and the way in which she models the Declaration of Sentiments to the Declaration of Independence. I think she's one of the most articulate intellectual giants she really is the brain of the women's rights movement, and for all the things that she maybe said that she shouldn't have, right, that she may have regretted on her deathbed. Whenever I teach Frederick Douglass, and I ask them whether he's a statesman, and is he prudent, and is he this or is he that, I always have a student that reminds me that Douglass didn't have the luxury of prudence, as some do. And so maybe if there's anything to remember about Stanton, that maybe she felt as though she did not have the luxury of prudence, and there wasn't time to walk on eggshells and to package this in a way that men could, digest, but instead to make the demand. So
All right. Well, we are about out of time. I want to thank both of our panelists, Dr. Hess and Dr. Taylor, for a terrific discussion. And I would like to thank our participants for their questions. Just a reminder about the email you'll be receiving with a link for the certificate of participation. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center. These are also offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program, a program that is obviously near and dear to my heart. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can also help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you'll be receiving by email next week, to your colleagues, as well as sharing it on social media. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, May 17th, when our subject will be George Washington's farewell address. And on that occasion, I'll be joined by Dr. Todd Estes of Oakland University and Dr. Robert M.S. McDonald of the United States Military Academy at West Point. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted. We hope to see you back here on May 17th. Have a terrific evening, everyone.